Hello, St. Mark's. In last week's video, I talked about English hymns in the 19th century and stopped sort of in the middle of the century. And as you could tell from last week, it's pretty controversial about whether or not to sing hymns in church. For example, the congregation who took their priest into ecclesiastical court to resolve the issue as to whether or not hymns were in fact allowed, and also this new movement within the Church of England that were originally called the Tractarians, and then the Puseites, and then eventually Anglo-Catholics. And this week, I'll continue where I left off, and with God's help, make it through the end of the 19th century. Industrialization in the 19th century in Britain brought a lot of societal change. The economic structure of the country completely changed. Some became very rich and others became very poor. Many moved from the countryside into urban areas for factory work. This shift from country to city reflected a change in the church structure. The established church, the Church of England, had less influence over people's lives, and Methodism flourished among the poorer classes. A new movement began in England among Anglican clergy who thought that the Oxford movement was too inward-looking and self-indulgently ecclesiastical, and they formed this new movement called the Christian Socialist movement. Like the Tractarians of the Oxford movement, the Christian Socialists also published tracts. Their tracts were called Politics for the People, whereas the Tractarians were mainly concerned with clergy. The Christian Socialists were concerned with the people. The Christian Socialist movement grew out of another movement called the Charterists, and the goals were similar as those of the Charterists, especially regarding universal male suffrage. However, the Christian Socialists were against violence. And they also worked from within the Church of England rather than outside of it. Of course, like all of the other religious groups that I've talked about in these videos, the Christian Socialists wrote hymns to reflect their agenda and their social reform that they were advocating. However, because they are so far out of the mainstream, very few of them have survived into modern hymnals. Hymn 566 is a rare example of one of these Christian Socialist hymns that occurs in a modern hymnal today. It's called "From Thee All Skill and Science Flow." And if you're an engineer or you have any sort of scientific background, perhaps you should look this hymn up and use it as part of your prayer life. Henry Scott Holland's hymn called "Judge Eternal, Throned in Splendor" is another example of a hymn from this movement. It's very appropriate for our day and age today, especially following the election from last week. And I hope that you will all look up this one. It's hymn number 596. In 1835, Vincent Novello, the organist at the Catholic Portuguese Embassy Chapel in London, published his hymn collection called The Psalmist, a collection of new and approved psalm and hymn tunes. Up to this point, hymns had been sung mainly in unison. Novello's collection was revolutionary by encouraging congregations to sing in 4 parts. This practice became more and more widespread throughout the 19th century, in large part to Novello's efforts, which were emulated by other hymnal editors. Another reformer from this time was W.H. Havergal. Though he was an evangelical, he reacted against the hymns produced by his predecessors in the evangelical wing of the church. His solution to hymnody was to look back toward those old metrical psalm tunes. And his hymn collection included English psalm tunes, along with many German tunes as well. And his use of German tunes set a new precedent that was followed by many hymnal editors who came after him. One hymn from Havergal's collections is hymn number 656, Blessed Are the Pure in Heart. And an example of a German tune included in Havergal's collection is hymn number 530, Spread, O Spread Thou Mighty Word. And the tune name is Gott sei Dank, which is To God Be Thanks. Another example of a hymn from Havergal's collection is hymn number 7, Christ Whose Glory Fills the Skies. And if you look down at the bottom, Havergal himself adapted this melody and harmonized it, and it's his harmonization we have in our hymnal. One last example of a hymn from Havergal's collection is hymn 66, the beloved Advent hymn, Come Thou Long-Expected Jesus. The tune name is Stuttgart. If you think back to several weeks ago, when I first started this series and I talked about hymns from the Reformation during the reign of Henry VIII, I talked about an English translation of German hymns called the Ghostly Psalms and Spiritual Songs. This collection was produced mainly for personal use at home and was not used in church. And after its publication and after its dissemination, when Henry decided that he no longer had political advantage with the German principalities, he had all of these German collections collected and burned. And so, from the time that King Henry VIII gathered up these collections and burned them, until the accession of the throne of George I in 1714, there was very little cross-pollination between hymn tunes in England and hymn tunes in Germany. Beginning with George I, German hymns were sung in the Royal German Chapel in St. James Palace in London. The chapel's keeper, Johann Christian Jacobi, translated a few German hymns and produced a small collection of hymns called A Collection of Divine Hymns Translated from the High Dutch in 1720. Dutch meaning Deutsch or German in German. 2 years later, this basic collection of 15 hymns was expanded to 120, and it was published with a new title, Psalmodia Germanica. In the 1740s, John Wesley produced translations of German hymns as well, which he encountered through Moravian missionaries. In the 19th century, Brits became increasingly interested in German hymnody due to several influences from the continent. First of all, Queen Victoria married her beloved Prince Albert, who was German. Second, Felix Mendelssohn was widely popular in England and came frequently to concertize. He made extensive use of German chorales in his music. And third, a renewed interest in the music of Johann Sebastian Bach came to England. And of course, Bach's music makes extensive use of German chorales. And lastly, an increased interest in hymnody meant looking for new sources. So some of this was newly composed hymns, and others was discovering hymns from other places. So all of this is happening at the same time that the Tractarians are translating Latin hymns and looking back to their Roman Catholic roots for inspiration. But others started looking toward the Protestant chorales of Germany to find that same inspiration. Christian K.J. von Bunsen was the Prussian ambassador to London, and he was pivotal in expanding the flow between Anglicans and Lutherans. First of all, Van Bunsen was very interested in the Book of Common Prayer. He was very impressed by its beauty, its language, its structure, and he advocated that the Book of Common Prayer should become the basis for worship in Lutheran churches in Germany. Von Bunsen also thought that the liturgical exchange should go both ways. So while Germans could learn from our written word as Anglicans, he felt that Anglicans could learn from the German chorale. Von Bunsen worked with many translators to translate German hymn texts into English. One of these translators was Frances Elizabeth Cox, who published a collection called Hymns from the German in 1841. An example of her hymn texts is hymn 408, Sing Praise to God Who Reigns Above. The tune is called Mit Freuden zart. Another translator that von Bunsen worked with was Catherine Winkworth. She is so prolific, it's unbelievable. Between 1855 and 1869, she produced almost 400 translations of German hymns. In 1855, she produced a collection called the Lyra Germanica, and she produced the chorale book for England in 1863, and a book called The Christian Singers of Germany in 1869. 10 of these 400 hymns appear in the hymnal 1982. Here are a few examples. The first is hymn number 67, Comfort, Comfort Ye My People, one of my favorite Advent hymns. Another is that great Lutheran classic, number 397, Now Thank We All Our God. And also, the first hymn I ever learned to play on the organ, hymn number 390, Praise to the Lord the Almighty. And also hymn number 339, Deck Thyself, My Soul, with Gladness, with the German title, Schmücke dich, o liebe Seele. Catherine Winkworth was not only a translator of hymns into English, but she also worked tirelessly for women's rights in the 19th century, especially in the line of university education for women. To support the cause of advocating for education for women, Catherine Winkworth translated not only hymns into English, but also literature. She wanted to prove that a woman could translate as well, if not better, than men. And some of the German literature that she translated included biographies of sisterhoods for the poor and the sick. She worked tirelessly to promote women's issues, and in fact, she died as she was traveling to a conference in 1878 on this topic. She's commemorated on the Episcopal Church's calendar on August 7th, along with John Mason Neale, who I've talked about at other points. Of course, hymns are meant to be sung by all Christians, not just adults, but also children. We do this a lot at St. Mark's, outside of COVID-tide, when we come together on Friday mornings for school Eucharist. There's nothing quite like hearing our school of approximately 500 kids singing the great hymns of our faith. This custom has long roots, and Isaac Watts produced a collection of hymns for children in 1715. Now, keep in mind that Watts was that rebellious teenager who hated what he was singing in church and complained to his parents about it, and his parents said, "Until you do something better, stop complaining." And so Watts did. He produced this collection to encourage other young people to sing hymns. In 1790, John Wesley produced another collection of hymns for children. In the preface to that volume, Wesley writes, "There are two ways of writing or speaking to children. One is to let ourselves down to them, the other to lift them up to us." Dr. Watts has wrote in the former way and has succeeded admirably well speaking to children as children and leaving them as he found them. The following hymns were written on the other plan. They contain strong and manly sense, yet expressed in such plain and easy language as even children can understand. But when they do understand them, they will be children no longer, only in years and stature. John Mason Neale, who I mentioned a few minutes ago in relation to Catherine Winkworth because they share a feast day on our calendar, also echoed Wesley's remarks in 1842, writing, "Long ago, I determined that if no one else did anything to free our poor children from the yoke of Watts, I would try. I have been seriously at work in the last 6 weeks and have accomplished a little volume of 34 texts." John Mason Neale's first collection of hymns was published in 1842 with the title Hymns for Children. 4 years later, his collection called Lyra Innocentium appeared. Hymnals at this time that were produced mainly for adults began to include a section for children as well. Cecil Francis Alexander published a collection called Hymns for Little Children in 1848. Several Episcopal standards have come from this collection. For example, hymn 102, which we did here at St. Mark's for the first time on Christmas Eve last year at the later service. Anyone who listens to the 9 lessons and carols from King's College in Cambridge recognizes that one. Another hymn from this collection is hymn number 370, "I Bind Unto Myself This Day." Now, most people either love this hymn or hate this hymn. I think I'm definitely in the minority because I can take it or leave it, but I know a lot of people feel very strongly Let me play just a little bit of this very long hymn. And a third hymn from this collection is hymn number 405, All Things Bright and Beautiful, which has been sung for a long time at St. Mark's School. And this hymn is interesting. I did not know the history of this hymn until I did this research for this week. And this hymn originally included a stanza that reflected the social structure of the time. The hymn read, "The rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate, God made them high or lowly, and ordered their estate." The Christian socialists would not stand for this idea, this advocation for God ordained that some people should be higher than others and yada, yada, yada. But the Christian socialists published a hymn in reaction to this, called The Working Man's Appeal, with the opposite stance. And it read, "Ye landlords of the nation, dowered by the chance of birth, with rank and wealth and station, the great ones of the earth, no more between you and your kind, place your old feudal towers, but meet us, mind with brother mind, and join your hands with us." The prevailing attitude in the Church of England at the time was to avoid the controversy by taking the middle ground. This hymn also has some beloved associations in popular culture. For example, those of you, I know there are many people at St. Mark's who watch The Crown, and those of you who have seen it, you probably remember the Aberfan episode, when all the kids of the town are sweetly rehearsing this hymn before the disaster that occurs the next day. Those of you who are Monty Python fans might remember what I think was part of Flying Circus, a spoof on this hymn, where the refrain text was changed to, "All things dull and ugly, all creatures short and squat, all things rude and nasty, the Lord God made the lot." If you Google it, it's out there on the internet, and it's hysterical. But just in case you can't remember what the tune sounds like, here's the refrain. In the mid-19th century, a brand new hymnal came on the scene. It was revolutionary in the way that it was put together and compiled. And in fact, it was so influential that many modern editions of this hymnal are still available for purchase and used in the Church of England today. This hymnal was called Hymns Ancient and Modern, and it was conceived on a train journey on the GWR, the Great Western Railway, which was affectionately known as God's Wonderful Railway, the GWR. And this trip that was so influential occurred in the summer of 1858. Two Anglican clergymen found themselves on the GWR, and these clergymen had produced hymn collections of their own and began discussing a new blended collection of hymns, blending their two previous collections. After they got off the train, they got in touch with others who had compiled hymns, and everyone seemed to be on board with this idea. These two clergymen and their few friends decided to combine efforts and cast the net even wider by taking an advertisement out in the Guardian newspaper on the 20th of October, 1858. There was a great interest in this idea, and the editorial committee was formed, but it had a strong tractarian bent. It was chaired by Sir Henry Baker and assisted by John Keble and John Mason Neale. This editorial committee established 3 priorities. First, all of the hymns from the Sarum Breviary, in the meters of the originals, should be either newly translated or taken over from the hymnal noted. Second, the hymns chosen by the editorial committee should be sent to all correspondents for approval. Third, to give the general hymns some that would be suitable for singing in mission rooms, at lectures in cottages, etc., rather than in church. We want such as it would give good grounds on which to admit some as to which we should otherwise feel bound to be more strict. In other words, to include hymns of a more devotional nature for use at home or schools rather than church services. Now, these editors were smart guys. They sent out 2 rounds of sample hymnals, trial booklets, to selected clergy. And after getting their opinions and doing some editorial work, the hymnal was finally ready for publication on Advent Sunday in 1860, with the music edition edited by W.H. Monk, organist and director of music at King's College, London, and this was issued in March 1861. The original hymnal contained 273 hymns, 110 of which were translations of Latin hymns. Now, the title seems to have come from Monk, the guy who created the music edition of the hymnal, and the idea came from hymn 135 in that hymnal, Holy, 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 because an ancient text is set with a modern tune. This hymnal was the first time the tune that we know was used with that text. Hymns Ancient and Modern was arranged essentially according to the church calendar. And the proprietors, as the editors were eventually called, produced a supplement of 113 hymns issued in 1868. By the time this supplement came out, 4.5 million copies of the basic version had been sold. Hymns Ancient and Modern was even exported here to the U.S., and 14 different printings occurred in New York and Philadelphia between 1866 and 1888. The success of Hymns Ancient and Modern was due largely to the inclusion of works from the most notable hymn writers and composers of the previous 50 years, as well as the most important publications. Original hymns, translations of German hymns, translations of Latin hymns, music from the old metrical psalters, and newly composed hymns were published largely in 4-part harmony. Sir Henry Baker, the chair of the editorial committee, one of the proprietors, wrote several new hymns in this collection. One of my top 10 favorite hymns was written by Baker, and we, in fact, sang it back in the hymn sing that we did on Ascension Day way back when. It's hymn number 432, O Praise Ye the Lord. Another of Baker's hymn texts is hymn number 645, The King of Love My Shepherd Is. The first edition of Hymns Ancient and Modern contains so many hymns that we sing here at St. Mark's that I'll play a very brief sample. Number 1 is 290, Come Ye Thankful People Come, that we sing at Thanksgiving time. And hymn 119, As with Gladness Men of Old, for Epiphany. Hymn 460, Alleluia, Sing to Jesus. Another hymn that Havergal included in his collection is hymn number 7, which is a morning hymn, Christ whose glory fills the skies. And if you look down at the bottom, you can see Havergal's name. Another hymn that Havergal included in his collection is hymn number 7. Hymn 410, Praise My Soul, the King of Heaven. And hymn 662, Abide With Me, which many people have chosen for their funerals. Hymn 525, The Church's One Foundation. Hymn 608, Eternal Father Strong to Save, the Navy hymn. And one final one is hymn number 562, Onward, Christian Soldiers. The choir has been asking about this one for a while during our Zoom sessions, so I'll play the whole thing. Choir, I love you. The year after the supplement was issued, the proprietors decided to issue a revised and enlarged version of their hymnal, incorporating some of these new tunes into the hymnal. Dr. John Stainer, the organist of what we would call Magdalen College, but the Brits call Magdalen College at Oxford, was added to the music committee. And yes, choir, that John Stainer, who wrote the setting of God So Loved the World that we all love to sing so much. This new edition of Hymns Ancient and Modern had a broader theological and ecclesiastical scope than the original Tractarian book, with more contemporary writing, outweighing the large body of Latin translated hymns. John Stainer's presence on the committee heavily influenced the harmonies used for hymns that became known as the Victorian hymn tune. They included many harmonic progressions that were very chromatic and a love of seventh chords. The second edition was issued in 1875 with major changes to translations, texts, and tunes. An additional supplement to this hymnal appeared in 1889 But other revisions to this hymnal failed due to its overwhelming popularity. People loved the hymnal the way it was. They didn't want to change. Now, as I mentioned previously, the effects of hymns ancient and modern were felt not only in England and throughout the UK, but also throughout the Commonwealth and here in the US. Now, remember the name hymns ancient and modern, because when I eventually tackle the subject of American hymns, this will come back again. And even today in England, there are editions of hymns ancient and modern being published. The most recent was from 2013. In the late 19th century, the British Empire continued to expand, and hymnody during this time period became increasingly nationalistic and militaristic. This militarism is perhaps very clear in the hymn Onward, Christian Soldiers that I played for you a few minutes ago. It was originally written as a Sunday school marching hymn. Get the kids up and moving and get the energy out so that they can sit still and listen to a lesson. It was originally paired with a hymn tune that was adapted from Haydn. But when St. Gertrude was written by Arthur Sullivan, it took on this new characteristic that all Christians were marching into battle. And by the way, yes, that Arthur Sullivan of Gilbert and Sullivan, the famous musical comedians. Many other hymn tunes from this period took on a different style, relying on chromatic chordal changes for their interest rather than melodic interest. One example is hymn number 42, Now the Day is Over. This tune is fairly static and not very interesting, but the chords are what provide interest in this hymn, hymn 42. You can hear that chromaticism that I was talking about on the bass line. Hymn writers of this period used flowery imagery and language reflecting a popular emotional style in their texts. And while many Victorian hymn tunes have made their way into modern hymnals, the ones that make the cut are usually the ones who avoid the worst excesses of Victorian populism. One hymn from this time period that I happen to really love is hymn 24, and choir camp choristers will remember this one, The Day Thou Gavest, Lord, is Ended. And that first phrase ends on one of those seventh chords I mentioned before. Another Victorian hymn from this period is hymn number 287, For All the Saints, that we sing on All Saints' Day. Now, if you really pay attention to these words, you can hear that militaristic fervor in this text as well. Another Victorian hymn from this time period is hymn 112 for Christmas, In the Bleak Midwinter. It's a beautiful hymn text by Christina Rossetti. And one last hymn from this time period is hymn number 48, O Day of Radiant Gladness. Now, lest you begin to think that the Wesleys' influence on church music ended when John Wesley died in 1791, fear not. The Wesley family had many clergymen and musicians in it, and well into the 19th century, Charles Wesley's grandson, Samuel Sebastian Wesley, edited hymnals that evoked an earlier tradition, shunning the saccharine sweet harmonies, those chromatic things and seventh chord things I was talking about, and the emotionalism of other composers of the time. Samuel Sebastian Wesley's hymns reflected the psalm tune style that from the earlier generations, and was also inspired by his lifelong study of the works of Johann Sebastian Bach. Wesley's style was considered austere by many contemporaries, and it took another generation for hymnal editors to recognize the quality of his work. We have 3 examples in our hymnal. One is hymn 461, which is set to the text, Alleluia, Sing to Jesus, and it's an alternate version for Hyfrydal, that I played a few minutes ago. And also hymn 525, which is in my top 10. I think my top 10 is expanding to about 50 in the course of this series. But this is the church's one foundation. And a very special hymn written by Samuel Sebastian Wesley, the tune written by him. It's hymn 704, O Thou Who Camest from Above. And it's beautiful because Samuel Sebastian's melody is paired with Charles Wesley, his grandfather's hymn text. And with that beautiful hymn, the sun sets on the 19th century. We have one more week of English hymns, and then we'll move on to something else. But that installment will be English hymns from the 20th century to about 1945. Because starting in 1945, I really run into copyright issues and hymns that I can't play in the course of these videos. I hope you're finding this interesting, and I hope to see all of you very soon.
Uh-oh, you're evaluating my work.
I am.
Are you subscribed?
I will with the red button.
And give us a thumbs up.
I'm a fan, of course.